around a little bit, figure out where my bearings are. So today I am working on getting a couple of pieces of wood or a few pieces of wood ready. I have been contacted by the gallery in Palisade, Craig Gallery. If you're ever on the western slope of Colorado, go check them out. They're representing some of my work. And they said that they wanted to have a few more pieces of mine, and this time more abstract. So I already build some, or create, whatever you want to call it. To me, it's kind of building, but I make these three-dimensional sculptures that are uh, working with different slabs of wood and different things, and I add pieces onto them and make them kind of like a cubist, brutalist, something or another. And I really like to do 3D, like self-standing pedestal or whatever. They don't want that though. They want wall hangings because that's what sells best in our area. For some reason, there's not much of a culture, if you want to call it that, of buying sculptures, like freestanding sculptures. I don't really understand it. I wish there was more uh, of that, but there's just not. And another thing is that traditionally this area has been very like focused on mountain whimsical or realistic works. So there's all of that to be considered as well. And I'm like kind of, not that I'm breaking ground because there have been other abstract artists and modernist artists, but it's definitely something that's not as common, and I'm trudging through to try to get that more represented out here in this area. So the reason that I'm making this video is because there are a number of things stated online about working with wood, and a lot of it's true, but it's a relative truth. And I don't mean to say that they're lying or hiding the truth. It's just based on experience and perspective of working with wood under certain conditions and circumstances. And that's very important to understand. You'll hear a lot about trees and woodworking and how they react when it comes to sun. And I'm gonna grab something real quick that I forgot to grab earlier. And people act like the fact that those trees or that wood was dried or not dried properly had makes the difference of how stable it is in every situation. Now I will say for certain that having your wood dried before you start working with it is key to having a good outcome of your product. So I'm not denying that. The more wet the wood is when you start working it, the more humid it is. It will start to split as it dries and things. But there is something to be thought about with all of this. So like I have gotten to where I build a lot of outdoor sculptures, and I build a lot of like stump stools and benches out of solid chunks of wood for being around like fireplaces or fire pits outside. And what happens is, even in a single season, so like summer, you're, depending on the kind of wood, you're going to get a lot more or a lot less movement just between the differences in temperature between the day and the night. And that wood will react, even if it's, your typical furniture grade 8% humidity, for being like super dry for woodworking with furniture. The best thing you can do, of course, is oil those pieces and keep them oiled or urethaned or waxed or whatever. That way it'll lock out extra moisture from coming in, and it'll also retain moisture in the wood that will have to fight to get out through that wax and oil, and will actually react slower. Eventually it's going to come out, and you're probably going to get splits no matter what. It's almost inevitable. But it will make a difference depending on how that is done, or what you've done to prepare it first, and what you're expecting. So I kind of quit making outdoor benches and stuff that were like thin slatted, even though I love that modern look. A lot of people make these benches, and they're like a 1x4 or whatever that they've milled out of you know, could be walnut, oak, whatever. And they sell them for outdoor benches, and they can be, but they need to be like in really shaded areas, and they need to be oiled or urethaned or whatever regularly, because even those will split. Now, there are some water resistant woods out there. So I want to make that very clear. Cedar is one of the better known and more affordable woods, even though it's not very cheap. You know, certain kinds of fir can actually do pretty well, even though it's kind of hard to find people who mill fir correctly. Like if you go to the local box store, a lot of that will be ponderosa or fir if you're on the West Coast or from the, you know, central US westward. But it has to be treated and it has to be milled appropriately for that fiber in that wood to react appropriately in weather. So I want to give you a quick example right here. This got dropped and it broke, but if you can see this right here, this is a 5-year-old piece that I made, a bowl. And when I started, this piece was super tight everywhere. Super tight everywhere. And it sat outside because I didn't really like it anymore. And it sat outside, and when it came outside, it opened up that gap about like that. So it came open, and you can see as I roll that bottom piece, I don't know if you can see with my arms in the way, but that bottom piece closes in tighter and the top opens. So even though this was well within the 8% humidity range, the reality of it is that just sitting outside, even 5 years after it had been finished and it was oiled, it started to split. And that split came all the way down to where this breakage is right here. Okay. So that is just a simple proof that, you know, this is a white fir. So that's, you know, not going to be, as a general rule, the best. It's not the best water resistant species out there, but it just shows that wood will continue to react no matter how dry it was when you start with it or how well you prepared it or whatever, if it sits outside for long periods of time. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing to know is that wood starts to change quite a bit from one process to the next. And I'm going to take you guys over to my log milling area that I do freehand milling. And I'm going to show you guys something that I think is important to understand. So the logs that I'm about to show you, let me see if I can get this to swap around. Do I hold it down? No, it just won't. Hey, Sloan's Galaxy, what's up? So this is an ash log right here. It's a green ash. Some people call it velvet ash. And this was about 2/3 dead when I removed it from a client's yard. It was standing, had some life in it, but it was. So this is a chunk of this piece right here is a chunk of that I cut off a couple of weeks ago. So it's off this log right here. You can see where I cut it there at the end. And if you look at this, there's some checking and splitting in here and whatnot, but it's not terrible. I mean, not for it having set out and dried with an open end, no wax, no nothing, okay? Now, what's interesting about this is that when I cut off this side here, this thing started to react in some weird ways. Now, this is part of that split that you saw that was already there, but that split opened up more when I cut it and I removed. Can you guys see that? I have a glare. I'm sorry. So when I slabbed off this edge right here, this split opened up more. And that's because the way that the wood fibers work on a trunk, they radiate outwards. And when you cut it square, all of a sudden you start to see that there are like end fibers that were making a full circle and creating a band those have been broken and then they release, just like a rubber band breaking. If you have a rubber band that is wrapped around something and then you cut that rubber band, even if it doesn't have enough tension to spring open and fly off, which most of the time a rubber band would, it will still open up and just lay there, and it will be shrunk and it will rescind back, right? And that's what happens when you're working with logs. That's why good mills that know how to do sawmill work and stuff, they know what they're doing. They know how to cut, and they can help you get the best cuts out of the wood so that it reacts the least. Now, that all being said, don't misunderstand. It's going to react. That's just how wood works. So the thing that I'm going for, which makes my work a little bit more challenging, is that I am actually going for the, sorry, putting you back on the tripod. I'm actually going for the wood to be as big as possible. And that's where the problem comes in, is because I'm not leaving much of the round band. I'm cutting all four, what we call half rounds, quarter rounds, or cants off. Depends on who you talk to, but the cants are usually those pieces that are, you know, flat on one side and have a round on the other. I'm cutting all four of those off. So now the fiber in there is just reacting like crazy. The more water you have in the trunk, the more it's going to react. However, it's going to react no matter what. There's no way of avoiding that, period. So when you start working with woods in these kind of scopes, well, when you work with wood in general, just know that you're going to have to learn how to work with wood, and you're going to have to make some adjustments, and you're going to have to learn how to design for your wood to work the way that you're hoping for it to in the final product. If it's indoors and you have a low humidity percent, even if it's a little higher than 8% or 9%, which is getting on the edge of what furniture builders consider too much, if you know, 8 to 12, I guess, is really kind of acceptable depending on where you live. Out here in the West, that's kind of acceptable. But 12 is really, really high. And the wood that you're getting at like box stores for construction are typically like way higher than that, 30 plus, and some of them have been like 80% recently. So the realities are that you have to start adjusting your design to make up for those future cracks or fractures, what we call checking, when you're working with it. So like on this piece here, this is a piece of Russian olive. Okay, you can tell the thickness is not even, it's not intended to be. This is a backing piece. I have just hand planed this down. It was really, really, really rough at first. Chainsaw milled about a year and a half ago, and it had kind of cupped and warped and whatever. It would have looked something like this, but you know, substantially larger. This is a very small piece that I'm going to work with here in a little bit. Or maybe even, this is still smaller than that one, but maybe more like this one, right? Something like that. But you can see the chainsaw marks in it. You can see that it's got split checked tops on it and whatever. And so I hand planed, well, I used the Makita electric planer, which I really love, by the way. I've had electric planers in the past, and this one by far my favorite. So check out the description when this video gets posted to my YouTube channel, and you can see a link that takes you to that planer if you're interested. But so like working with this, if I was to leave it like this and somebody hung this outside where these check marks are, it would start to split more aggressively with time. So all of this would start to split further down. There could be certain grains here that would start to split more aggressively. And that would start to potentially compromise the piece that I built. So a lot of times what I'll do is, in the design that I make, I will make something that's either plywood or steel, or, you know, you name it. It can be anything that has a more stable structure, and plywood does have a more stable structure. And the reason it has a more stable structure is because if you've ever looked at plywood, I've got a piece around here, hold on one second. Sorry about that, didn't mean to run off the camera. But if you've ever looked at plywood, people often think of these plies just being veneers of wood, and they are technically that. However, the difference with plywood is each veneer is laid in a different direction. So the top and the bottom are laid in a vertical direction with the length of the board or the sheet, because that's the most aesthetically pleasing to the eye as a general rule, and it often works better with cutting and different things, as this stuff is intended for furniture or cabinet building or whatever. But the layers in there, like the next layer in, the second layer in, is actually going perpendicular a lot of times to the first layer. So the grain is cross-hatched through the thickness of this, which makes this a much more stable product from the sense of movement and splitting. That's why when you see plywood split, it's usually just the top layer that's exposed to the sun, not all the way through the grain like it would be on a solid piece of, slab. And so I will use these a lot of times as a piece that is mounted, and this will become a retaining part for the slab, so the slab doesn't split open. There are better and worse ways of doing that, so that's something to keep in mind. Epoxies and things like that work, but epoxy has a shelf life, so keep that in mind. Anything made with epoxy, as a general rule, it can last a long time, but epoxy starts to deteriorate. So there's a chance that in 50 years, if you're building with CA glues or epoxy, two-part epoxies or whatever, you're going to have a piece that kind of self-disintegrates in 50 years. That's kind of an interesting thing to talk about, and we'll talk about that in the future as far as artwork goes, in my opinion on that. But so you can use metal strapping, you can use all kinds of different things to bind these together and cross that grain. And you're going to want to do that as a general rule. You're going to want to go something that can hold these grains together so that it doesn't split out. And it just depends on what you want to do to make that happen. You can use sticks or whatever if you're into that kind of design. Just something that has a long grain, if it's wood, going perpendicular, that you can attach, that will be solid, to hold those grains from splitting outward. That's probably the best thing you can do to stabilize these woods. If you use something like steel or aluminum, that's going to work as well. Encasing in epoxy is not a bad option. I try not to use that much epoxy, just because I don't like all the microplastics being created from epoxy work. It's just a personal preference. I'm not trying to put that on anybody. So hopefully that kind of helps you guys out and gives you a little bit of information about working with wood. There are times, however, just so you know, that working with green wood is the best time to work with wood. There are certain woods that become extremely difficult to work when they're super dry. Ash is one of those. Walnut, not so much, but it can be. You'll find that you get a lot of burn marks from certain kinds of sanders. You get all this stuff happening, and it makes it a challenge to work with it. Hickory is definitely one. Osage orange, you're going to want to work it when it's green, and you're just going to want to make sure that you work it in a way that it's going to react the best possible. Now, another thing that you can do to help your wood that you're working with dry better is if you can find a kiln somewhere, because the way a kiln works is the way it dries the moisture out of wood is a little bit different than just sun baking. Well, it's a lot different actually. And so therefore it creates a better result and a less dynamic expansion and contraction on the wood when it's being dried. And essentially what you're doing when you are drying wood is you're contracting it really fast, getting all that moisture out of there, because when it's humid, it expands, right? So hopefully that helps you guys out a little bit. And I will be doing some work, and I'll probably do another live later on some of the progress of my work that I'm doing, and we will talk about these projects at that time. All right, thank you guys. Have a good day. Take care.